Charles, give us a hoy once you're restreaming me and when you want me to start. So there's a question in the chat. Does anyone know what synesthesia is? Sarah is saying that isn't that the one where parts of the brain are responsible for the senses that get crossed over and or connected wrong, so they can perceive X sense in terms of Y sense. So hearing in terms of sight might be substituting X and Y. Like sounds might have colors or words might have shapes. That's a pretty good definition of synesthesia. Cool. So let me know if you have ever experienced what might be synesthesia in terms of a crossing over of the senses. So I've just started recording. So we're back in, and this is super exciting that we're back in a zone where we can actually have a little bit of interactivity. So I can have a look at the chat in the back channel, whatever you're sort of saying, I can get a little bit of feedback from, which is really great. It's kind of two threads happening right now, one under me and another one under Charles's conversation. So I'll just click back and forth between them. But this lecture is, it's titled Synesthesia More Than Meets the Eye. It's loosely based around synesthesia, and synesthesia is going to be this way of connecting to Charles's lecture on accessing data or creating data that can then feed your programs. In fact, feeding our experiences, feeding data and interpreting data and filtering data is a huge part of how humans understand the world around us. And we're going to start a little bit with synesthesia and use synesthesia as a sort of jumping off point to talk a little bit more about metaphor in the sort of like cognitive brainy sense, to get a sense that why there is this sense that art sometimes is a form of truth, and then how you can either use data to create metaphor, or how you can sort of understand metaphor as a way to judge how you're going with your major work and what you're trying to produce. So synesthesia is, as Sarah mentioned on the chat, it's basically when a thing from one sensory mode gets represented by a different sensory mode. So for example, here's a question: what does a circle sound like? If you were to ask someone who experiences synesthesia what a circle sounds like, they might have the exact type of synesthesia that tells you, well, a circle has a very sort of soft timbre. It's a little bit like a flute, except if a flute kind of crossbred with a synthesizer sine wave. That might be a synesthetic sort of description. And not everyone with synesthesia would necessarily agree that a circle sounds like that, but some way in their sort of neural interpretation of sensory information, what happens is that there is a sort of alignment of certain aspects of sight that correspond to certain experiences of hearing. And so they get paired together. And it can become a very productive way for people to become excellent at mathematics. For example, if there is a certain type of synesthesia in which numbers have colors and numbers have sounds, or sounds have numbers, and so as these start to become enmeshed in cross-modal patterns, it can be a really useful shorthand for people to think really quickly within those domains and across those domains. Yes, so Ben's experience of hay fever feeling corresponds to the sound of the sneeze. Let's allow that as a sort of stretched form of synesthesia. I like that. So what does a circle sound like, or what number is the color yellow? If anyone has ever experienced any kind of synesthesia, give us a heads up in the chat. What have you what visual thing has sounded like something, or what sonic thing has smelt like something? What does an A sharp smell like? Is that a meaningful sort of experience for you to talk about? And if you had an answer to any of these questions, you may be synesthetic. So from the chat, there doesn't look like there's any examples of someone actually having synesthesia. Sarah's mentioned she hasn't, but has seen some cool artwork by people who have. Nice. And we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to have few examples where synesthesia might have come into play in the production of some key works of art in the history of modern art in particular. But before we do, I just want to see if there's a moment where anyone can tell me which of these two shapes is named booba. If you think it's the shape on the left, right, just type left into the chat. If you think it's the shape on the right, just type in the right into the shape, into the text. So whichever shape, if it's left or if it's right, just say which one you think is booba. And we'll get a sense of your agreement. Ben reckons that the right one's name is Boba. Sarah's saying that the second one seems a bit more booba-ish because it's rounder. Townie's saying right. All right, so there's a little bit of agreement in terms of which of these two is boba. And so that means that given that there's Kiki and there's boba, we can make a judgment about which shape is Kiki and which shape is booba. And the rationale around that was that the booba seems a little bit rounder, and by implication it may be that Kiki sounds a little bit sharper. So let's think a little bit about what this implies. The neuroscientists V.S. Ramachandran suggested that actually this test indicates that we are all to some extent synesthetic. Rowan is in the minority thinking that the one on the left is booba. So, or maybe she is referring to which one is Kiki. Hard to tell in the sort of time of assessing the chat. But this is sort of considered as a sort of suggestive proof that actually we are all in some ways synesthetic, and this is a debate that continues to go on. And part of what comes out of that debate is this idea that, well, the letters and the words in boba correspond to rounder shapes, but then also the kinds of shapes that we see there correspond to the kind of movements that we have to make with our mouth and the kind of way that things hear. Whereas kiki sounds, it has a sound, like a soundness of sharp, of staccato, and so there are these cross modalities that come from a sort of shared common experience. So even if you aren't, even if you just hate the number 8 because it's a really disgusting brown or color that you hate and it's represented that's quite an extreme, intense form of synesthesia. But to a degree, we all have some kind of cross modality in which we interpret data from one sensory modality through previous experience with another. And if we didn't have that, then actually it would be really hard to navigate the world around us. So Vasily Kandinsky was a really renowned painter in the early 20th century. This is a 1923 painting where Kandinsky has made a series of shapes in response to certain types of music. So, for example, this is in response to a Schoenberg concerto, where Kandinsky is aiming at representing certain kinds of sounds with certain kinds of angles. So sharp sounds, loud, staccato, and then sort of might be represented with more angular forms, ascending, descending crescendos through these sort of arcs that sort of start smaller and then, amplify. these kinds of wiggly forms and these kind of horizontal and vertical sort of sharp intersected forms, Kandinsky thought represented a sense of what certain kinds of instrumentation sounded like, what certain kinds of harmonies sounded like. And these sort of circular, sort of deep circles kind of represented a sort of bass, or at least, you know, I can't actually quote Kandinsky on that one in particular, but it feels like a bassy beat. It's deep in color, and sometimes we consider that deep in like musical tone. And then the relational colors around that, like a purple against a very deep blue and black, suggest a kind of relationship of adjacency and a sort of pulsation. And so when we look at images, we get similar kinds of qualities that we can get out of music. And Kandinsky was really, he held music up as the highest form of art. And he wanted his paintings to be able to do the beautiful things that he thought that music could do. And so he aimed at these sorts of symphonies to do that. I just want to show you a little video of an Oscar Fischinger, what he called an optical poem from 1938. And Fischinger used a similar kind of sensibility when it came to the matching of musical shape and image in his optical poems. So I'm just going to open it up in this other little way here. Just takes me half a second to get it out. And while I do that, I'm going to, hopefully the sound comes through. Cool. Cool. So that's just an excerpt of Oscar Fissinger's 1938 optical poem, and so I've embedded a YouTube link, YouTube video, in the slides there. Should you want to jump onto that, so watch that at your leisure. But what's really interesting is that Oscar Fischinger in 1938 is using a really similar visual sort of rhetoric to Vasily Kandinsky. You know, these sort of circles, when they're large, producing sort of like large volumetric sort of beats, but then these squares taking on sort of sharper kinds of sounds that sort of relate to the idea of a corner or a shard of something. And that's quite a compelling example of something that's just like over 80 years ago was being made in very analog strategies of film, so a very laborious thing. Now we could program this much more quickly and animate it much more quickly, but then this is a sort of studio-made thing made with extraordinary symphonic classical music. So then this is what jazz looks like, or in Stuart Davis's swing. So there's something a lot more bendy, wiggly, sort of organic looking, possibly going towards a sort of funk aesthetic around sort of blobby, twisted, intertwined kinds of forms when it comes to looking at swing. But then also the vibrancy of the colors is really hard-edged, so there's a strong sort of dynamism and what we might call a pop graphic sensibility as musical languages shifted from a sort of classical modality to something more like swing. And Stuart Davis painted this in the same year that Oscar Fischinger made his video. So as there's these sort of shifts in sort of musical vocabulary, but then at the same time we can also look at this kind of imagery and consider the idea of how then these images start to then take on a certain kind of connotation in and of themselves, and then are used more broadly in culture to signify a sort of feel of partiness, a feel of enjoyability and happiness and joy, in a very different rhetoric to say how Vasily Kandinsky's interpretations of a classical composition might come in. And this is from Henri Matisse's suite of his illustrated book called Jazz, which there is a copy of that book in the Art Gallery New South Wales. It's an artist book. And what he had done is kind of used this sort of biomorphic forms that sort of a jazz scale has with its improvisational sort of structure, and overlaid that in sort of areas of staccato rhythms and hard flat colors, inspired by jazz composition. And what's important to think about this is that as things get translated to new compositional structures, what ends up happening is that they take on entirely new realities. For example, this image and Stuart Davis' swing image, they're not exactly jazz or swing. They kind of evoke jazz or swing. And so in a sense we can say that they take jazz and swing as a starting point, and they leap off from that and interpret jazz or swing in a new sensory modality. But that sensory modality isn't a direct translation, because they are different senses and they have different powers and different ways of being built. One uses sound waves, one uses light waves. They behave very differently, and so that's something to consider, that none of this is an equals relationship, it's an approximated relationship. And that's a big part of generating new ideas, is through translation we can approximate things, and that approximation gives us a sort of understanding of some of the qualities of the thing, but it doesn't necessarily stop the conversation at that. it then gives us a new thing to generate that from. So for example, if we weren't necessarily a huge fan of jazz, we could still be a huge fan of Henri Matisse's illustrated book imagery. And then if we were to synesthetically translate Henri Matisse's jazz images, we may not necessarily arrive at a jazz composition, we might arrive at something else entirely. So this process of taking a synesthetic approach in the design and art making process can be a really effective way to generate novel outcomes. So, so a big part of what I want you to take away is that if ever you're thinking, okay, I'm a little stuck, one thing to think about is, okay, how could I produce this image that I've made in music? And then that can give you the new impetus for new inspiration and new ideas. And part of the reason that this works and why there can be a certain level of agreement in synesthetic experiences is that we do understand new concepts by comparing them to previous experiences. And this is a big part of how we understand art and how art communicates to us. My slide's been a little mixed up, but I am just going to briefly talk about this example. So we got as far up to jazz, and in recent years, going back to synesthesia, Neil Harbison is a colorblind person who is now a self-identifying cyborg, and as a colorblind person, he has augmented his sensory capability by having a what he calls an eyeborg, which is this antennae inserted into his skull and to the back of his brain, and that produces a sort of sound wave. And there's a little kind of camera at the sort of end of his antenna, and if he faces that towards something, then that camera judges the color of the thing, and then it sends the information down to the back of his head, and that triggers the audio experience of sort of sound frequency. And so by translating color into a sound frequency, Neil Harbison has become able to actually take color and make it meaningful, even though he can't distinguish colors from each other. He can now point his camera at something and then hear that in a sonic sense, and then those tones start to he can shape those tones in terms of common experience. And he makes art from these experiences. For example, this is because he has seen so many colors and seen those colors translated into sound. He can now listen to music and translate it back the other way by just sort of making notations about if he hears a sound, he compares that to his previous experience from his eyeborg, and then he can go, okay, well, that section of music was this sort of fuchsia color, then that section of music or that tone or that instrument is this other color, and he uses that as a base to make digital images, which are sometimes printed, sometimes painted. And this is an example of Amy Winehouse's Rehab. Now, Amy Winehouse is a very different kind of musician to Beethoven. If one of these was square, the other one probably wouldn't be. So in this translation process, this heightens the this sort of foregrounds the fact that when we translate things, certain things get illuminated from that translation and certain things get lost in that translation. So this is now where that slide was supposed to be. So we understand new concepts by comparing them to previous experiences. If you had a certain kind of fridge magnet that had the number 1 on your fridge and you just like anchored that, then number 1 may be a certain orange for you for the rest of your life. So certain kinds of experiences will anchor themselves in your memory and head in there. And this is really sort of in line with George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's idea of the conceptual metaphor. In 1980, they published this very influential paper called Conceptual Metaphor in Everyday Language. And what they said was that metaphors exist at a really primary level of our experience and our language, but all of our metaphoric sort of language exists as and is based upon very fundamental human experiences of how we use our bodies. So physical things that we do tell us, like feed us back things that are good or bad, or things that we like or dislike. And then from those things, like maybe spatial orientation is one of those, we start to judge the rest of the world in those terms. So through our physical experience, we feel the world, and then through our linguistic experience, we attribute those feelings to certain things, right? So maybe the clearest concept in this sort of metaphoric approach is the idea that up is good. So Lakoff and Johnson, in their paper, they talk about spatial orientation and how certain things mean, good or bad, but up is always meaning good. And is that arbitrary? Well, certain kinds of theories might say that actually it's all just subjective, or it's all just relative. But what these two authors do say is that, well, actually, no, there's a lot of reason why we might think that up is good. If we are healthy and fit, we can be upright. We can rise above certain things, and rising above often means positioning us in a certain level of dominance or power over something. So if we rise above, we are sort of more powerful, whereas down is bad. When we're down, we might be kind of unwell and laying down. We might be dead. Down is bad. And so these kinds of judgments about if someone is up, it's good. If they're down, it's not so good. And then this affects in ideas of body language. So if someone is up, if they're confident, they come across as in a very good position. And if they're down, they might be hunched over. They might be sort of like, frown pointing down. So we share that kind of common experience, and then with that we make assessments of whether something is good or not. So if we have the metaphor that up is good, then we might have a metaphor coming out of that says, Tommy, Tommy's up. He's on the up. What that means is maybe he's like rising the ranks of his organization, or maybe Jenny's up. What does that mean? Oh, she's she's up and about, she's moving, she's really got it. And so the idea of up as an increasing experience, as being a positive experience, we have visual languages like the economy is up. All these things are up. So up might not be totally relative, except that there are examples in cultures where spatial orientation does change from example to example. One example that they give is that spatial orientation changes with respect to whether things are ahead or behind other things or us. So for example, in our culture, if I have object 1 in front of me and then object 2 further in front of me, then object 2 is ahead, whereas in some cultures, because of how a photographer might see it from the other side, object 1 is behind object 2, when in fact when we look at it, object 1 is in front of object 2 in relation to us. So sometimes these spatial relationships change, and so that can have implications on how we then use language and interpret things going forward. But then some other examples that are raised is we often, in our language, we talk a lot about how argument is war. Okay, so if we were to have an argument, politicians are a really good example of this. Someone defends their position, someone else attacks their position, someone makes a point, and then someone else, kind of demolishes the other person's argument. Someone might give up some ground, someone might gain some ground in an argument. But what if we chose instead to frame the idea of the argument in rather than war, what if we said argument is in fact dance? Okay, so what if argument was dance? All of our metaphors for argument would have to change. For example, it may not be that someone demolished someone else's argument. It may be that one arguer took the lead and the other one took the follow. It might mean that someone built upon someone else's argument in a way that is similar to a sort of pirouette. Okay, and then all of a sudden, what happens when we start to talk about argument as dance is that we start to take away a sort of adversarial position of argument, and instead we replace that with a cooperative sense of argument. And so for quite a fundamental metaphor, then we would actually have a very different system of sort of dialectical debate of any kind that can, build new things. Similar to our other examples, for example, love is a journey. A married couple that's been together for a long time will sort of have a sense of that kind of metaphor. But if we switch up love is a journey, which is quite a beautiful, meandering, cooperative example, then we change it to love is madness, which might actually be something that someone who's been embittered by love, or someone who's had a lot of volatile relationships, or even someone who's a teenager and they've just felt that like intense, frustration of girl problems or boy problems, then that can be, that sets up a very different set of metaphors about how you can talk about that thing. So why are we talking about metaphor? Well, this kind of idea of metaphor is very different to the idea of metaphor in poetry, because metaphor in poetry, for example, is often a sort of linguistic concept in which we just sort of take something and compare it to something else, and it's sort of a device where we can be persuasive and whatever else. But what George Lakoff and Mark Johnson are actually saying is that everything about our thinking is in metaphor, and if we stop thinking about it in terms of a linguistic or written device, we can actually start to think about it in terms of like fundamental ways that we appraise the world. And this is essentially what artists do. Artists make metaphors, and we'll have a few kind of examples. Shortly after this paper was published, I don't know if Jenny Holzer had read Lakoff and Johnson's paper, but Jenny Holzer was making these text works called truisms, where in it she has a very similar structure to the kinds of metaphors that Lakoff and Johnson talk about. This is Times Square. Once upon a time, Times Square looked like this, and she had this billboard, and her truisms would play on this billboard for a period of time in 1982. And one of them is torture is barbaric. And so what that's doing is it's saying torture is barbaric. Barbarism being, an uncivilized, mean, brutish thing. For example, we can think about this metaphor being flipped, like torture is sophisticated. What if we said that? Or torture is elegant, or it may not gel very well, but it actually starts to take the qualities of the thing and overlay it on terms of the other thing. So if we say torture is barbaric, that paints torture in a barbaric light. If we say torture is exquisite, maybe you're thinking about a evil villain, but what we're doing is we're taking the qualities of exquisiteness and applying them to torture. So let's have a look at some of her other truisms. This is from a print. A really good one is, an elite is inevitable. Decency is a relative thing. Dependence can be a meal ticket. So, okay, here's this one. Eating too much is criminal. It's a great metaphor because there's no law against eating too much in pretty much any culture that I'm aware of. But criminal doesn't necessarily mean that a law has been committed in a metaphorical context. What it's saying is that eating too much is a bad thing and almost should be criminal. So Jenny Holzer and her truisms have made a real break by taking the qualities of one thing and overlaying them with the qualities of another. And so this is why art can feel true, because if we agree with the fundamental metaphor of, let's say we agree with the fundamental metaphor that argument is war, what that does is it takes away a whole lot of other attributes of what argument is. And so then means that we can't quite see certain aspects of it, but it foregrounds the others, and so then we can start to agree with sub-metaphors within that. So for example, the metaphor of he annihilated her position, or she dominated the arena, or so-and-so struggled to gain any ground in that argument. Those metaphors work because we agree on this kind of meta-metaphor of argument is war. And so this is sort of a long way of kind of saying that metaphors beget metaphors, and within sort of metaphor chains, truths are accepted, but they're metaphoric truths. They're not real. But they these authors believed that these were experiences that structure every single aspect of our thought. And George Lakoff has gone on to write about the impact of this in art. So, for example, this painting by Wayne Thiebaud is kind of a metaphor for gravity, for being pulled. So there's this sense that, the bus at the top of the hill farther from the viewer is, almost not even, how could that thing even make it up the hill? And what we do when we look at this image is we bring all of our recollections of struggling against gravity to this image. So this is this sort of laborious thing about gravity where we're trying to pull ourselves up from the downward force of gravity, which is actually trying to, take us down into the dumps or the ditch or whatever it is. So this painting is not just something that we look at. This painting, according to George Lakoff, with these metaphors, this painting is actually something that we feel because of our past experiences with physical struggles against gravity. Maybe you've been in a car that struggled to get up a hill because it's just got a really low cylinder or something. And then we also read this in terms of body language of characters. So Lakoff talks about Rembrandt's Christ at Emmaus from 1648, about how the servant is above Christ. The servant is the figure that's kind of highest up in the plane, and he's standing up so that he can serve these two, but he's sort of hunched over in a way to sort of diminish his stature and serve and be a servant to the other figures in the painting. And he talks about Christ's pose as being somewhat regarding of the servant by tilting his head up towards him in a way to be humble and etc. So this idea of up plays in this role here. It's a conflict between Christ, who's elevated in the belief of Christianity, and the servant who's not the Son of God in this story, and them trying to reconcile their status and trying to foreground body languages of humility around this idea of up. In fact, if you watch dogs, figure out a pecking order, the dog that lowers themselves ends up being the submissive one to the top dog, and so we have ideas for top and bottom dogs in that sense, and that implies a sort of social hierarchy. And part of this is because we can read these gestures and we can read these things about gravity because we have these nerve cells in our brain called mirror cells and Cannon cells. And a mirror cell enables us to look at someone's position and then imagine what it's like to contort our body into that position, and then what kind of emotion we'd be likely to experience if we were in that position, or what kinds of emotions we have experienced in that position. And similarly, so that's the mirror neurons. And then the Cannon neurons, what they do is they see an object and they imagine how that object can be interacted with bodily. And so this is how Henry Moore's two forms from 1934 we consider this through both mirror neurons and our Canon neurons. We think about how would something need to be held, how would something need to be touched, and then we can see the gestures that these forms are putting, and they're actually based on a Corot painting of a mother and a child, and the mother sort of looming over the child to assist the child. And so we get a sense of this idea of a kind of form sort of cupping and protecting another form. Or perhaps we could read it as a form aiming to devour a smaller form. Either way, we start to personify and anthropomorphize these because they take on familiar postures that we understand. And as we interpret that, we do that through our body. Mary Cassatt was a really amazing example from the early 20th century of someone who managed to convey touch. And if anyone has ever experienced nursing a baby, then one would understand that this immediately probably conveys a sense of that experience of being attached to another organism, your child or a child, and then that child feeding from you, and the experience that creates, perhaps the fatigue of your own body having to provide for that other body, or on a hot summer's day, that sort of sweaty match. This is Adolf Menzel's The Iron Rolling Mill, where we see in the bottom right hand corner, I should say, the workers breaking from their shift in front of the iron, huddled behind a stone, trying to just get some relief from the radiating heat of the iron works. And as we look at this, we remember a time when we've had to be close to fire, where we have had to be close to radiated heat, and we empathize with the people drinking water, just trying to stay hydrated. Adolf Menzel was considered by Michael Fried as a master of realism, which he called the ability to make us believe that we're in a real world, and not just in terms of making something look photorealistic, but actually in terms of convincing us that that radiant heat is currently coming out towards us. So we appreciate these things in terms of metaphor, in terms of this entire arrangement being a metaphor for radiant heat, or this Mary Cassatt, Baby John nursing, as a metaphor for touch. And if we start to think about, okay, what is this thing a metaphor of? We can start to think about our own works that we make as metaphors, equivalent to this is that. Okay, and this is never that. This is always this, and that is always that. But when we say this is that, we're kind of providing we're overlaying a framework where we're obscuring certain truths to illuminate other truths that are common to experience. And that's exactly what Graham Harman says is what differentiates art from non-art, that all art is based on metaphor. It's based on this becoming that through a process of metaphor. So argument has to become war. I won't go into it too much. I've just included this slide in case you want to follow up what Graham Harman's ontography is. He's an ontologist, which is a philosopher that understands or seeks to understand what actually exists. But he says that real objects are objects that exist that we can't mentally represent, we can't access them, we don't have the capacity to do it. Sensual objects are objects that we can mentally represent and kind of understand to some degree. And then objects have qualities, some of which we can't mentally represent, so they're called real qualities. And some of them are sensual, we can sense them. Don't worry, you don't need to remember that. But what he says about metaphor is that a metaphor is where in an object, the real object recedes, but we can sense the object's qualities. And that's kind of what gives art a bit of its aura. And he uses the two examples, a teacher is like a candle, to convey that the difference between what he terms as a literal thing and what he terms as a metaphorical thing. And his other example is the wine dark sea. Okay, so if you've ever seen a wine dark sea, maybe place an example of it in the chat. Yeah, Ben, I think your example of if you've walked around San Francisco with the Wayne Thiebaud painting, that's probably going to bring back a lot of those experiences and memories around that pull of gravity on those large hills, large slopes. So a teacher is like a candle. So if we were to literally, okay, so if we were to take the literal meaning of that, that literally means a person who teaches other people in a school is like a cylindrical piece of wax with string inside that can carry a flame. Okay, so if we literally interpret a metaphor, what we come away with is a very meaningless concept. It doesn't really make sense. We can't see in the qualities or the functions any correspondence on a literal level. For example, a person who teaches in a school doesn't actually have, isn't made of wax. They don't have string inside them, and they can't carry a flame, or at least they could, but they're not supposed to because that would kill them, that would be bad, blah, blah, blah. At the same time, in a metaphorical sense, what we can take away from this is that teachers illuminate the minds of their pupils. So this is quite an inspiring thing for anyone to do, to illuminate something. And what it does is it takes the properties of a candle and it overlays them onto a teacher to provide a sense of, yes, teachers are not pieces of string with wax. It takes it takes the qualities of a candle and overlays them onto the teacher, and then we look for, we as the viewers, we actually construct the object that is the candle-like teacher, and we complete that object. And so there is actually no object. There is actually no teacher that's like a cylindrical piece of wax. But if we take those two things, we can create a correspondence, almost like an interference pattern, where we can see a structure that overlays those two around illumination and the metaphor of illumination, like light is knowledge. So these kind of metaphors play upon those things. And that's the fundamental difference between art and non-art. We learn that teachers illuminate those around us from these metaphors, but we don't assume that candles teach us anything, because it's assumed already we know that they illuminate a room. Okay, so we then become the artwork. The artwork lives in our minds, in a sense. In Homer's Iliad, the sea is described in multiple occasions as wine dark, which has confounded readers in English, and very few people have come up with a fixed interpretation. There are some theories that people in ancient Greece couldn't see the color blue, and so as a result, Homer has written this as wine dark, but if they had blue sensing neurons, they would have seen it properly. And Harman's assessment of the whole thing is that, no, it's actually just a compelling metaphor that creates an object that would never be accessible to us. Something being wine dark, connoting a red ocean, but we can sort of imagine what the qualities of a wine dark sea would need to be, and they have a sort of emotive foreboding in their crimsony sort of qualities, and in their intoxication of wine, we associate all these sort of connotations to them. Okay, so this brings me to data. Okay, because the outcome of this, or the implications of this, is that literalness is an art killer, and that if you want to make an artwork, you need to avoid literalness. So I'm sure you've all seen a graph like this before, where if you've ever checked your Instagram statistics or any kind of social media thing, or your web analytics, you've probably come up with a very uninspiring kind of graph like this that's really good at informing you of literal things that have happened in your kind of online life and interface. but that we don't really. But this is literal. Now, what would a metaphoric data visualization be like? This is Anna Madeline Raupak. She teaches at the ANU School of Art and Design, and this is a series where it's called Controlled Burn. It's got a title, and it's burnt matches and pencil on paper. And what these are is the top temperatures in leap years since 1999 in Canberra, Adelaide, and Alice Springs, as a way of visualizing temperature increases. So as we can see from the top left to the bottom right, the graph, the black on the matchsticks, which tell the graph, are increasing. So we get the metrical information about temperature, but we do so through a symbol of a matchstick that has been burnt by the artist and glued to the piece of paper along the graph. Now, what is this doing? Well, this is doing a few things. So matches have a myriad of connotations and potentials, some of them being, when you light a match, they have a very familiar smell of sulfur that's going to remind you of a birthday cake or a celebration. At the same time, what they do is they there's sort of a small unit that can show you something that is burnt, and it burns along a line, so it's sort of perfect for data visualization of any linear scale like temperature. But then in terms of bushfires, they also connect to the danger of lighting a fire in this sort of increasingly hot environment, and they literally visualize burningness on the match. But then when seen in this sort of array of temperatures, we see a metaphor of heating up, of we can smell the match just by looking at the picture. We can feel the heat of having lit a match. So this is an example of how we can take data and how we can make it metaphorically meaningful. So the increase in temperature is now lighting a match. It's taking a risk. It's takes on those metaphorical connotations. I did just have one last example that I wanted to show you, which I think is a really good work by another ANU School of Art artist, Baden Palethorpe, who took a range of data from an AFL game, taken from AFL players' GPS locations and audio of the crowd roar, to try and visualize the sort of sound of a sports game, because a sports crowd is like a really large, massive group of people that yell and scream and carry on, and they're quite an enormously loud and raucous thing. So what Baden did was he had a GoPro Omni 360, which is a 360-degree camera device that produces photogrammetry, and he made this sort of photogrammetry model of the Sydney Cricket Ground using this 360 video and DSLR photography to create this 3D environment that was then put in a game engine. And he collected so this is part of the data of all the photogrammetry. And then he collected data from GPS information with AFL players wearing things, and like the Sydney Swans and Collingwood wore these data things that then sends data to the AFL, and then he was able to get permission to receive that and chuck it into an Excel spreadsheet. And then from their X and Y coordinates, he had enough to map a flat axis of the football field, and he wanted to create a three-dimensional structure of the crowd. And so he used the sound of the crowd to so he used the sort of volume of the crowd whenever a player had the ball, whatever sound that the crowd made when that player had the ball became the sort of height axis amongst this. And so with the player position on the field and the volume of the crowd, he then had a three-dimensional point that he could pinpoint on into this thing. And then that set a whole lot of dot points that then meant that he could pinpoint that and model the impact of or the audio into a sort of pictorial three-dimensional structure. And then I guess he took liberties in terms of the color of this structure, which is this kind of beigey, sort of Caucasian-y skin tone. And then with that, he made this image, he sort of digitally sculpted this thing that is a monster. And that metaphor, it kind of says that that crowds are monsters, and that sports crowds are like it's a monstrous kind of thing. And so it's compelling because if you've ever been enveloped in a sort of sports, in the mayhem and the cacophony of sports supporters, you can get that experience. But then by modeling and using that data and then shaping that data in a meaningful way, he created this visual monster that then goes to represent the extraordinary intensity of and palpability of something that didn't have any kind of solid form beforehand. And I've included, I won't show it, I was going to show it, but I've gone on too long about a couple of other things. But I wanted to use those two examples as examples of how you can shape data into a metaphoric thing. So this is that. Heat is burning in Anna Madeline, in Baden Palethorpe's, like sports crowds are monsters, or even just herds are monsters, has a huge implication for a kind of idea of mob rule, democracy. We can make all kinds of metaphoric associations around that. And that's kind of, I guess, my position on synesthesia. Synesthesia is really about taking data from one data source, your sense, your some kind of bodily sense, and then interpreting it through another kind of medium, through another kind of sensory filter and data point, to then generate new kinds of forms, just like data collection, data interpretation, and inference and output can take on metaphoric forms. So the name Booba and Kiki attached to these kinds of forms give us a sort of metaphor and create endearing characters for these kinds of forms. I'll leave it there, but those YouTubes are in the slides and you can check them out as much as you like. I'm just going to jump back into Teams and see. Yes, Ben, maybe there was a blood moon in the sky at the time of the wine dark sea, and that's a quite a good interpretation of a sort of biblical ancient thing where apparently the moon turned red at the crucifixion. Students are like the darkness. I love it. Thanks for everyone for your comments. I'll wrap this up now because I'm sure you've got other classes that you need to head to. Thanks very much for your input, and those slides should be up now, and I will upload the video to anyone that wasn't able to be here in person. I'll chuck that up on whatever the MS Streams and Echo, the Savo. Thanks very much, everyone.